person who has no idea what SAMR is, could you introduce to us in an elevator pitch sort of format what it all is about?
Sure. SAMR is about thinking what type of uses of the technology make a difference in the classroom. I don't want the technology to just be there as a fancy doorstop. I also don't want it to just not be really making any changes. So the genesis of SAMR was to say, what does make a change, right? And my research said, okay, two key things are involved here. On the one hand, what does the new technology bring to the table that the older technologies that we used in schools did not have? Right? So before we used books, pencil and paper, blackboards, whiteboards, etc. So what does a laptop computer or a tablet bring to the table that can be done with them that the older technologies cannot do? That's one of the key elements. The other key element is to say, all right, so that's what the technology brings to the table. How's your teaching practice being changed? And there are three major possibilities. One, it just remains the same. So you have the technology, but you do exactly the same thing you were doing before. A second one is to say you keep the heart of what you are doing the same because you're a good teacher. You know how some things help students, but you change them quite significantly. In other words, you start making some rather noticeable changes to what you are doing, even as the heart of it remains the same. And the third option is you say, I always wished I could do this, but I never could. So you create new things that replace old things, old methodologies, old activities that are made possible then by this new technology. So those are the two things that are involved in SAMR. And from that result 4 levels. The substitution level, in which I'm doing exactly the same thing with the new technology, but I use no new features of the new technology. It's just doing what my old technologies allow me to do. So I'm reading a book, I'm marking it up. I can do exactly the same thing with an ebook, but I do nothing else to change how things work. At the augmentation level, I say I'm still doing the same thing, but now I'm using something that significantly enhances what I'm doing. So I'm reading that book, but in addition to reading that book, I also have speech synthesis. So the book can be read to me, and we know all students get something good from getting their reading in more than one channel, not just visually, but also through audio. So that would be an augmentation level improvement. And I started to see at that point some small improvements in student outcomes. At substitution, I really don't see any changes in student outcomes. Then I go up to the next level, which is modification, and I say, there were things about my teaching practice that I knew at heart were good, but I could make better. I knew that having students write essays so that they could clarify what they're thinking for themselves while at the same time they show me that they've understood something was always valuable. But I always had them write these essays and just turn it in to me. I'd grade them and hand them back. And it was always desirable for me to say, well, how about all of you read each other's essays and comment on them to have social reading and writing taking place? But that was very difficult to do with the old technologies. You could photocopy something and hand it around, but frankly, it never worked properly. Today, with blogs, for instance, we can make that happen. So now the technology allows me to say, keep the heart of the matter, writing essays to clarify your own thoughts and to provide me with assessment material to see how you're doing. Okay, so I'll keep the heart of that the same, but I'm going to significantly modify it by changing it from just a teacher to student individual activity to a social activity that brings in many more eyes, many more opportunities for commentary, rethinking, rewriting, thus improving the task. And I'm at the modification level, and now at this level I start to see noticeable improvements in student outcomes. Finally, the upper level, which is the redefinition level, is when I say, there are things I've always wanted to do, but I never could, period. So it's not just modify significantly something I was doing before, it's create something new altogether. So suppose I wanted to have the students take their thinking in one domain that they've always been doing as writing essays, and say, but I want you thinking in a different domain, like video, because when we ask students to express thoughts in different domains, they think differently, and they express differently, so they expand how they might think. So I'm going to say to students, okay, you've been doing these social writing posts on your blog, and these are great, but now for your final synthesis, I want to see it synthesized not into a blog post, but into a well-created, well-crafted, carefully thought out video that will express what you're thinking, the summation of everything you've done. And now I'm at the redefinition level because I've given the students a new activity that does everything the same things, all the same things the old activity does. I still have the students thinking, synthesizing what they thought about, etc. But in addition to that, now I've got a whole new activity that allows them to explore a new domain, express in a new domain, think differently, more deeply. And that is going to give me, as a result, much larger improvements in student outcomes.
So how long did it take you to put the SAMR model together? Did you wake up and you saw it in your cereal at breakfast one morning? Or, what was the beginning to the end where you felt like you could share it at conferences and among the world?
Good question. Boy, I should buy better cereal, I guess. I didn't see it in my cereal. No, it started in the mid-'80s as the result of some work I was doing on reforming introductory sciences education at the undergraduate level in colleges and universities. That's where it started. That's where I was using some of these tools and finding that assumptions then prevalent in many cases as to, well, just buy this tool and it'll always do the same thing, were just not true. So that's where it started. Continued through the 90s when I developed a whole series of experiments as a college professor, as well as being the director of one of the original new media centers. So I had the tool set and I had willing students willing to try out things, other fellow faculty, researchers willing to share information, sources of information from beyond the educational sphere, from the business sphere, for instance, that I could say, well, it's not exactly the same, but I can learn something from how businesses were changed. And by the early 2000s, I was comfortable enough with it that I was ready to take it on the road. The version you see right now of SAMR, the final version with the 4 levels and the descriptions I've just given you, dates from around 2002, roughly, in its inception and presentation at conferences and so on.
So one of the ways people often talk about SAMR is they'll describe how ebooks can move from one level to the next. So they'll take a particular tech tool and then follow it along the continuum, kind of how you would use it. But when you describe SAMR, you talk about it more in terms of a concept, ecosystems, or a particular curriculum that you're teaching. Is that a better way of approaching the model?
Well, the model has to work for you. So if you're comfortable starting from a technological perspective and it works for you, all the more power. I like to focus on what the learning is supposed to be. What do I want the kids to be getting out of it, right? So that's why I talk, for instance, about ecosystems, because for me, the key question is not which tech tool I'm going to use at this point in time, but rather to take a step back and say, what do I want children to understand about an ecosystem that I've never seen them understand before? Where can I help dispel confusion? Where can I help them become scientists than rather be told about science? And I say, okay, so now which tools would help make that possible? That's my approach. I know some people are well inspired by saying, I see what this tech tool allows me to do and can build from there. And if that works for them, that's okay too.
While you were telling us all about your SAMR model, there was something that actually touched my heart as a student. You said that it's significant that having a specific knowledge of the student body that you're teaching, that it's important, and that's what empowers schools. And how do you think integration of technology, especially your model, into education aids that happening?
That's a great question. I think if you're looking at SAMR and the process I talk about for building SAMR ladders, where you're thinking about how you use the technology throughout a unit of instruction and so on, can help in that process by saying, how is this technology best suited to the needs and interests of these students, and to have the students themselves choose, because that's the other key component, right? We don't have to, as teachers, be doing all the choosing, all the deciding, quite the contrary. The more the students can be brought into the process, the more they can say, well, I think this would work for me. I think this would help me. I think that this would be the type of tool that would help me investigate my passions, my interests, and so on. So I think there's rich opportunities, if you're using SAMR, to say, how do we use this as a language so that teachers and students can talk about this and further develop that aspect of truly personalized learning to the needs and interests of students.
So SAMR, as it stands, was articulated first in 2002. And it's been 12 years, and we at our own school, we use that SAMR language, and it's very helpful. Moving forward, what do you see as the greatest challenge to both understanding and implementing the SAMR concept?
Good question. I think that when I look at where schools find challenges, it's in moving from augmentation to modification. Many schools start doing a great job. They do very well at moving from substitution to augmentation. They have very good practice. But then in terms of not just, say, hitting peaks on projects or one teacher going there, but as a school as a whole, having systematic practice at the modification to redefinition levels, I find that they frequently encounter a challenge there. And I think the answer to that challenge, if you ask me, what else do schools need to bring to the table, is to look at the additional professional development knowledge that teachers operate with. It has to go beyond the pure technical and technological knowledge. It has to do with how they integrate, for instance, pedagogical knowledge and the knowledge of their content area, to get back to your question, right? Which allows them to say, I know this content area, but I'm not just going to say, here's the book and I just slap it in front of the students. I'm going to carefully recontextualize, rethink, represent it so that students can make better use of it, access it more readily, be able to incorporate it into their knowledge base more readily. Schulman talked about this as pedagogical content knowledge. And I think that that type of consideration is at the heart of what's needed to move schools from systematic practice at the augmentation to modification and redefinition levels. So that's one of the key components, focusing on those pedagogical and content knowledge aspects. The other aspect I would emphasize is you really need teachers talking with the world and talking with each other. Talking with the world, they have to have their own personal learning networks. They have to have all sorts of tools. Each teacher is different. Some will do great with professional societies. Others will use tools like Twitter to harvest information. Others, maybe it's Facebook or LinkedIn. Doesn't matter. A hybrid of, paper books with e-books, with these sources. However they're building their personal learning networks. But it's important for them to have these connections to the broader world of practice, knowledge, etc. And at the same time to be talking with each other, sharing knowledge, sharing questions as communities of practice within the schools. And these two components are really essential, if you ask me again about challenges, in responding to these challenges in moving forward.
Well, I'm going to be doing some consulting work in spring at a school specifically concerning the SEMR model. So I'm deeply interested in this. When I leave and you find yourself at this school so that I know I'm going to do it right, what do you want to see? Like what would be evidence in your mind as you go about saying, okay, they understand SEMR?
I think for me, the evidence would be how they're thinking about using the technology, right? It doesn't mean that they've been exposed to SEMR and suddenly, boom, everything is up redefinition. That never happens. It takes time. But am I hearing from the teachers this type of thinking about what are the goals of the students, their own teaching goals, and how that's going to help shape the technology in terms that could be used to say, oh, I see how they're shaping future practice at the upper levels of SAMR. That's the type of thing I'd like to see them doing. And in a very specific context, since you're going to be doing this consulting process with this school, what I try to do when I go into a school and I work with them is I try to make sure that they can do something right away. So I try to take them through the process of building basic SAMR ladders in small teams, somewhere between 3 to 5 people, and have them do that as an afternoon activity so that they see it's not, is there a challenge? Does it take time? Of course. But at the same time, if they're all talking with each other, sharing ideas, quickly hashing out ideas, using SAMR as a framework, I find that by the end of the day, they can be at the point where they say, okay, it's going to take some work. I need to, develop my practice and so on, but I can do it. And I can see how to connect pedagogy and content to the technology in this way.
So let me turn to a more personal question. So I've attended conferences like this over the last 4 years, let's say, and I've seen the SAMR model become more ubiquitous and see more conversations about SAMR. So how does it feel to have this idea that you've worked on for so long suddenly become so popular? What's
Wonderful.
that like?
Absolutely wonderful. It feels great. I mean, when I created the model, one of my goals was I don't want this sitting on the shelf. I don't want it to be just, one, yes, that's very nice, but nobody knows how to use this. I want it to be used by people, and to see it make a change and to see both of those things happen to me is wonderful, because that's the most gratifying thing. And it's the other thing that's absolutely wonderful about it is seeing people start to say, well, I used SAMR for this, and then I thought about this and said, wow, I never thought you could use technology like that. So SAMR helped you see that, create things we've never seen before. That's wonderful. It really feels great.
I want to give you a more student-centric question. I find that education, in the end, why we keep on finding better ways to teach students is that we want to have them have a better understanding of what they want in their future. And in your presentation, while you were discussing the model of a museum, I thought this is brilliant because this could be a better way of students accessing their passion. So in that manner, how do you think improvement in technological teaching can help students find their passion for their future?
One of the things that used to be difficult with some of the older technologies in many areas was the question of how to give students the resources for individualized exploration, individualized learning. If I only have so much in the way of money to buy books for the school library, even the richest schools have to say, oh, well, we're going to make a guess as to what the students are going to want, and we'll have a spectrum of resources to cover that. A poorer school might not even have that, right? Today, with what's opened up to us through initiatives like the Museums Initiative you're mentioning, through the resources, open educational resources available on the net, the availability of rich materials and a wealth of other people to communicate with, to talk to online, suddenly a whole new world has opened up for students to find those things that they need to develop the passion. So it's a combination of the resources, the materials, the possibilities, the people, and the tools to make that effective, to make it not just be a conversation, but, well, I don't have the tool to operate upon this. It's also the tools for students to create something that responds to those passions. One other aspect in which it also can help is in the sense of perhaps providing structures that allow for greater clarity. You know, one of the things we've had for a very, very long time, I can go back to the 1920s, with initiatives, for instance, in terms of saying schools where what is to be learned is not predetermined, but is decided jointly by teachers and students, and some wonderful experiments. But some of those experiments run into the problem of saying, wait, we decided that 5 months ago, what was going to happen next? So it was hard to keep track of all of the bits and pieces and so on. The technology can help with that. So you still have that process of saying, perhaps, for this element or these components, it's going to be what is to be learned and how it's going to be learned is going to be the result of this conversation. But in addition to that, you have the tools for visualizing, for keeping track, for making it easier for all parties involved to really have this come to fruition and not be, it was such a beautiful dream, but we just couldn't make it happen, which is sometimes what happened before.
So you also talked about in your presentation that the data for why we need to be using technology in schools is incredibly compelling.
Absolutely.
That there shouldn't be any question anymore whether or not technology should be in schools. It's a done deal.
Absolutely.
So why then do you think there's still resistance, that people are still struggling with that? There's still attitudes of why we shouldn't be using this in the classroom, it's not appropriate?
Right, that's a very good question. I think there are several things. Number one, even though the data is, as you say, extremely compelling, that doesn't mean that the way we frequently see the technology being used corresponds to the data that's compelling. So if I see somebody saying, I brought in ebooks, and all they're doing is straight substitution, they're not even changing what books they're reading, they're just reading the same old book, right, and not changing the task in any way, shape, or form, and then they don't see a change. They say, well, we just spent all this money on the tablets to read the ebooks, but nothing changed, so I guess it's bad. It's like, well, it's not the fault of the technology if you're not leveraging it to do things that go beyond. And in some cases, I've seen the technology be used in downright, negative ways, and there are ways that we know from the research we shouldn't do. So a perfect example, for instance, is when I see people say, well, we no longer, want to have the students doing this work with problem solving in mathematics. They just can go and see we have this online electronic drilling system. So suddenly I see the kids spending a lot of time on the drilling system and less time talking with the teacher about perhaps the things that would drive their interest, their understanding and passion. Again, that's not the fault of the technology. It's just that you're misusing it. It just has become, a way to just give the kids a perpetual multiple choice test rather than a tool for exploration. So you want to be thinking about, again, what tools, for instance, in math could you use to explore, to create, and so on. And that becomes a good use. So that's one of the reasons I think that we see this reluctance, that bad uses are misunderstood as this is the only thing you can get. The other factor, to be perfectly frank, becomes one of cost. And many people look at how much it costs to bring, say, a device and then the software to run on the device, and they say, well, that's a lot of money. And for me, the question is always, well, there is money to be spent, but what are we spending money on now that wouldn't need to be spent on this? And the usual answer you'll get is, of course, well, I'll save some on paper books and buy ebooks. But to me, there's a bigger picture, right? if we're looking at the number of opportunities, the number of passions lost, the number of careers that never happened, the number of dreams, creations that never occurred because we didn't respond to what those children, what those students could do, that has a cost too. And for me, the cost of a device and the software to run on it is so small compared with that we really need to factor that into the equations as well. So it's both a question of how do you use it, and also seeing that the cost is really not just a cost and that's it. It's really an investment, and the payoff is great.
You mentioned that no profession stays the same, and it is even more so because technology is really endless, isn't it? So what would be your dream, your wishful vision of educational technology that has yet to be manifested?
That's a great question. You saw a little bit towards the end of my talk. I'm fascinated by what Watson and similar technologies can make possible. I'm fascinated not in the sense of replacement, which is again another misunderstanding. I don't think Watson is going to replace a human being thinking. To me, the question is, how might we think differently or better with Watson than without Watson? I think differently or better with a book than without a book, right? When books became commonly available, that changed how people thought. It wasn't just a question of, they thought exactly the same, but now you have a book. It actually changed how people thought. When movies became available, that changed how people thought. There are even, I've seen actually some interesting studies indicating that even people's dreams have changed, as a result of the ongoing presence of movies in their lives. So for me, the question is then, technologies like Watson, what can they make possible? How might we think otherwise? How might we think in ways we have not thought before, more richly, more deeply, more creatively, more fruitfully, using these tools? So that's for me one of the great avenues yet to be explored. And the other thing that we're seeing right now explode is the whole question of connectivity, right? So for me, it becomes a question of what else can a device that I have with me tell me about the world? What else can it put me in touch with? Sometimes I see the fear, and it's not entirely unjustified, of the isolation in devices. But for me, it's a question of let's learn how to not isolate ourselves in our devices, and instead look at how the evolution of the technology can, if anything, give us a richer, almost a richer sensorium, where we have deeper perceptions of the world around us as partially mediated, assisted in this process by the devices.
All right, the final question. So we're at this conference maybe 5, heck, maybe 10 years from now. Where do you hope that SAMR has gone? Do you think it'll have changed, or are your focus going to be mostly on just spreading what it is now?
Very good question. I'm hoping, if you ask me for my hope is that by that point, most schools would be practicing how they use the technology in their regular use, in their regular practice at the upper levels of SAMR, and that what we would be looking would be at a whole new generation of processes, a whole new generation of projects, so that the SAMR ladder I presented today, people will say, oh, that was nice, but that's yesterday. Now that's substitution for us. Now let me show you the new ladder we're going to build, that starts there, but watch what we can do now. That's my hope, that what we're going to be looking at is a whole new generation of projects, objectives that are made possible by the fact that a majority of schools have systematized their practice in such a way that they're using the devices, using the technology at what we would call today the R level, but that tomorrow would just be a platform to build further ahead, build further ideas, further courses, further developments from.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. That was good.
Thank you.
Particularly, thank you. I particularly appreciate you said, because it just occurred to me, this is how slow I am.